All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're all joining us. So welcome to this We Value Nature training, scoping a first natural capital assessment. We're very excited for you to be joining us today for this training. So I'm Katia Bonga. I will be your host for today's session. I'm an associate at WBCSD, and the education is part of the Redefining Value program. And I will be walking you through the session today. So I've been working at WBCSD for a bit more than 3 years now. And since the past year and a half, I have been leading all of the capacity building efforts of the We Value Nature campaign. And I will be giving you in just a few minutes a bit more information about the We Value Nature campaign. But before I do that, please let me present you our great speakers that we're going to have today. So today we will be having Stephanie Heim that will be doing the training for us. So Dr. Stephanie Heim is the Managing Director of Little Blue Research. She has spent more than 10 years addressing sustainability challenges. She supported the Natural Capital Coalition as its technical director, overseeing the development of the Natural Capital Protocol and sector guides as well. She also led the KPMG UK Sustainability Services team work on True Value methodology. And finally, she's also worked as a senior environmental economist for FTech and senior research associate at the Center for Social and Economic Research. So a huge welcome to Stephanie Heim, and a big thanks again for being here with us today. So Stephanie Heim has been the one alongside her team to help develop this module training that you're going to be walked through today. And so thanks again for all of that. We're also really lucky to have Paula Guimaraes that is going to be joining us today. So Paula is the sustainability manager at the Navigator company, where she has been working for 25 years. She is the company's liaison delegate member for WBCSD and its affiliate BCSD Portugal, as well as the representative at WBCSD's Forest Solutions Group project. She is part of the company's Sustainability Forum and Environmental Council, and has extensive experience in developing and implementing corporate approaches on forest sustainability, responsible forest management, and certification in Navigator. So a huge welcome to you, Paula, and a big thanks again for joining us today. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Navigator company is a company based in Portugal and is an integrated forest producer whose end products is pulp and paper, tissue, and energy. And so Paula will be sharing a practical case study relating to the training today. And finally, in addition to the great speakers that you'll have today, we also have a support team behind that is helping. So I will be continuously helping and responding to questions coming in the chat. But we also have today Ryan and Sabina, who also work at the Little Blue Research and have also helped in developing this training material. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions. We'll all be there to help you today. So before we do kick off, just a few elements to go through with you. In terms of housekeeping, as you probably know, this session is being recorded. Slides and recording will be shared with you. At the moment, you are muted to avoid any background noises. And again, as I've just mentioned, please, any questions you have, make use of the chat function that you should have at the bottom of your Zoom. Please also do let me remind you that we operate under an antitrust provisions. So we invite you to avoid any discussions and any conversation of competitively sensitive topics, such as those that are listed on the slides right now. I'd also like to just take a couple of minutes to introduce you to the World Business Council of Sustainable Development, as I'm aware some of you may be less familiar with the organization. So we are a global members-based organization of over 200 businesses leading in the sustainability arena and collectively representing business leadership for a sustainable future. And so on the next slide, you'll be able to see our members, which have a global footprint and represent really a wide variety of sectors, as you can see, and really represent our collective membership. Our work programs are member-led and focused on 6 system transformation themes that you can see on the screen. We also have some sector-specific projects, such as the Forest Solutions Group, which I've mentioned Paula is part of, the Chemical Coordination Group, the Agribusiness Alliance, and the tire industry. Each program is broken down into a range of projects focusing on more specific topics. And if you're keen to learn more about our organization, please go onto our website for more information. So today's agenda, so it's going to be a bit of a particular session for those of you that have perhaps taken part in previous sessions organized by WBCSD as part of our virtual event series. This is actually going to be a training. So the point will be really for you to come out with some learning elements. And so for the agenda today, we're going to kick off by setting the scene and introducing natural capital. Stephanie is going to walk us through the business case for assessing natural capital and some common assessments that we're observing among businesses. She's then going to give some tips on how to identify natural capital impacts and dependencies, as well as some practical considerations to take into account when scoping your first natural capital assessment. And finally, we'll then have Paula present the work that she is doing in terms of natural capital within the Navigator company before we then wrap up the session. So a quick few words on the We Value Nature campaign. The We Value Nature campaign is a 3 years project, which is funded by the Horizon 2020 grant system from the European Commission. It's a 2.5 year project. And as you can see, we're several partners involved. So WBCSD, which I'm representing today, is one of the key partners in this campaign. We also have the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as well as OPLA, which is our communications partner in these efforts. And all of us together are directly supporting the work of the Natural Capital Coalition. And actually, I should be referring to the Capitals Coalition, as some of you know, perhaps that the Social and Human Capitals Coalition and the Natural Capital Coalition have now come together to represent the Capitals Coalition. So some of the main activities that we do with the We Value Nature campaign, well, essentially what we're trying to do is increase business uptake of natural capital approaches. And to do that, we do a lot of sharing best practices, useful resources. IUCN is working a lot around the identification of barriers and opportunities for businesses to adopt a natural capital approach. And today is a perfect example of some of the practical support that we also provide for businesses. So we do a lot of online training, like the example of one today. We also do some train-to-trainer sessions, as well as many other activities, which I'll come to share with you by the end of this training. Just to situate yourself as well in today's training, we actually already have a Module 1 training available on our website at the moment. And what you can see here is that we have included all of the useful resources from that Module 1 training and adapted those resources to different timings. So at this stage already now, you can actually download our Module 1 training, the resources, so agenda, slide deck, speaking notes, etc., for you to eventually do a training if you wish. But today, the training we're going to be walking you through is our Module 2 training. So Module 1 is really a very basic introduction into what natural capital is, why it's important for business decision-making and risk management, whereas today's training is really going to be about sharing the key resources and knowledge that you need to actually start scoping your own first natural capital assessment. And as I've already mentioned, Little Blue Research has been helping us develop that training. So what are the learning objectives for you today? The main objectives will be for you to understand how to identify natural capital impacts and dependencies, acquire the necessary resources and understanding to begin to scope your own assessment. And then, as I've mentioned, we're going to be sharing some key practical considerations and steps that you need to take. The idea is to be as practical as possible today and for you to come up with some useful tools. We do have only an hour and a half for today's session, so it's going to be, you're going to get a glimpse into some of the training material. We will soon be uploading the full training version that will be going up to 3 hours. So if you're keen to learn more about this subject, you'll be able to access all of that soon. Just a few final words. What's important to note is that the Natural Capital Protocol is the main resource that is used in our training sessions. So the Natural Capital Protocol is an overarching globally accepted framework that really aims to help businesses identify, measure, and value its direct and indirect impacts and dependencies on natural capital. And the aim is really to generate trusted, credible, and actionable information that business managers need to make more informed decisions. And what's also important to note with the protocol is that it builds on many existing approaches already used within businesses. So it's not a replicate, it's really building off of many existing approaches out there. I'm not going to say much more at this stage because Stephanie Jaime is going to be providing a bit more details onto that. And finally, you should have, in principle, all received a participant workbook. So that workbook is really meant to guide you through this training session. You'll see that we have added a lot of the slides that you'll be seeing today, but as well as additional slides to give you more information if you wish, and also lots of useful links and resources that you can access. And you can also easily have access to the Natural Capital Protocol, which was also sent to you in principle, but I'll have Ryan or Sabina send again the links in the chat for you. So with no further ado, I'd like to now warmly welcome Stephanie Jaime to take over as a peer for the training. And thanks again to all of you guys for being here today. So over to you, Stephanie.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katia. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you can all see my slides. Katia?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Fantastic. Well, thank you for that introduction. So what I'm going to do now is take a moment to think about current situation and how that is impacting sustainability and the consideration of sustainability in business, but also do a bit of a recap on some definitions through Mentimeter with Katia's help. So we really have to reference the ongoing crisis because it has had such an impact on businesses in general. I think it's interesting to see from our perspective that that impact is quite different depending on the sector that you're looking at, but it seems to have in a number of cases ignited more of an interest in sustainability than maybe we would have predicted. So some of that has been through calls for a greener recovery after the crisis, but also it's increased interest in the training courses that have been running, and also really started to get business to focus on resilience and its dependencies. Now that's wider than natural capital, but it's an interesting development in the area. It started to be seen as resilience being a key indicator of business success and practicality. So we just wanted to make a nod to the crisis and understand that there are changes afoot. It would be interesting to see how those changes develop in the near future. So what we want to do as a starting point is understand how you understand or define natural capital. And what I'm going to ask you to do now is to go to menti.com and enter the following code. Katia, if I ask you to take over the screen, then you can begin the Menti session.
Thanks, Stephanie. So for those of you that aren't as familiar, just go onto the website of Mentimeter, www.menti.com, and integrate the code that you can see at the moment on the screen. So 182008. And we'll leave a couple of minutes for you guys to answer.
Oh, hang on, Katia, that's slightly the wrong question. That's the last one.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that, indeed. There we are.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So don't be shy. Take a look at your workbooks as well if that helps. But really, we want to understand how you define natural capital. Okay, our first one, capital that can provide environmental services, that doesn't destroy the environment, all ecosystems existing on the planet. Okay. I'll give you a few more minutes. All natural resources needed to run my business. Stock and flow of renewable and non-renewable. value of ecosystem service and their benefits that underpin and sustain all life on Earth, and capacity of natural systems to create value, stock of renewable, non-renewable resources, management of natural resources, and some more stock of natural resources and ecosystems. That's great. So thank you very much for inputting into that. Katia, oh, I'm going to ask to grab the screen back. Thank you very much. Now, the point of that exercise was to show that there are different ways to approach natural capital in this environment, and actually the way that we do is we use the definitions that's in the natural capital protocol. So natural capital is the stock of renewable and non-renewable natural resources, e.g. plants, animals, air, water, soils, minerals, that combine to yield a flow of services to people. And in turn, these flows provide value to business and society. So as a quick point, biodiversity underpins these, and during Paula's case study, we'll have a bit more reference to that in particular. But I think the other point is to consider the value to business and society. Given the protocol is focused on business, we are looking at it from quite a human perspective. So I just want the group to keep that in mind as we continue. Okay, so I'm just going to put up these different points. This overarching framework, it is really there to try and illustrate some of the connections between business, society, and the natural environment, natural capital. And essentially it is showing that businesses impact and depend upon natural capital. There is a relationship that delivers costs and benefits both back to business and society, and in turn these can be risks or opportunities both for business but also for society as well. So it's just providing that overarching picture, and we'll come into each of these as we go through the training. Before we continue, we're going to have a quick word of ecosystem services. So again, when we are considering what flows businesses benefit from nature, we do so under this classification of ecosystem services, and they really are the benefits to people from ecosystems. So thinking about those services, they include things like timber, recreation, pollination, water purification, climate regulation, and so on. And they can be classified in slightly different ways. So they're often called provisioning services, which are things that are material outputs from nature, like timber or fibre or fuel. There are regulating services, so these are the processes that nature does that we might depend on, like flood control and climate change. They're also classified as cultural services, so this is non-material outputs of nature, spiritual wellness, education, those sorts of things, and not material use of nature. And finally, supporting services, so underpinning all of those, the big biological and ecological processes of the planet that help drive and allow the planet to thrive and us to survive as a species. So Katia has mentioned it already, but I'm just going to mention it too. We are focusing here on natural capital specifically, and ecology and nature. But nature isn't alone in its bubble. As we saw from our framework, it's underpinning some of that business value that's created, and also underpinning society as well. And we're just taking a moment to nod that while we're focusing on nature for this presentation, there are those links to social and human capital, and that's most brilliantly illustrated by the amalgamation of those two coalitions to make the Capital's coalition. And it's also worth noting that the frameworks of both the Natural Capital Protocol and Social and Human Capital Protocol have been developed in a similar way. They have the same phases and a line in terms of the steps under each section. So it's a nod that while we focus on nature, there is a greater interest in terms of integrating these different approaches together to get a more holistic view of business issues and to help business decision making. Okay, so the module 2 we're going to have a look at today is firmly within the scoping stage of the natural capital approach, and particularly steps 3 and 4. So scoping our assessment and trying to figure out the impacts and dependencies of our business. The full length module 2 training will focus on introducing the measure and value section as well. So it just gives you an idea as to the extent that will be covered in module 2 when it's finally released. Okay, so we now want to take a quick look at the business case for assessing natural capital and some of the common assessments that have taken place. So I'm going to quickly talk through some of these risks that are shown, risks and opportunities that are shown here. So there are a number of ways to consider this, from reputational up in the top right hand corner, where your consumers and your customers might start to get concerned about your behaviour or start to be aware of your impacts as a company. There are also operational opportunities and risks. So here, this is an illustration of the Vale Dam collapse, actually, and a dependency or a nature-based issue that led to an operational fault. There are other issues, for example, water scarcity, that would be a common operational issue that is often caused or one that companies look at. Legal risks, what are you responsible for in terms of cleaning up an environmental catastrophe? If your business activities have caused it, and what can that look like? So several oil and gas examples of where people have been sued and asked to clean up things, and also financial risks, so where people have lost license to operate because of environmental considerations, and that then having an issue, an impact on their share prices. So if we just click through to show maybe the opportunity side that's available through doing these assessments, it's really about thinking, okay, if we've got a risk in our operations, can we somehow mitigate it by changing our operations or our energy usage or our water usage? Can we use a reputation or change our reputation or think about how our brand interacts with the environment to send out a positive message to our consumers that will give us a competitive advantage? Can we use something slightly different if we need to run a cleanup, or if we need to put in infrastructure for cleaning up discharges of water or so on? Could we build that in a different way? Could we put a wetland habitat together to result in the same function without resorting to a more general infrastructure project? And can we, as companies, access more finance or access different terms within financial agreements such as loans if we can link them to our ESG performance? Those are all the sorts of things that are both risks and opportunities associated with natural capital assessments. So why assess these things? Well, doing it with the Natural Capital Protocol is helpful because it allows you to understand the relationship your business has with nature in a structured way. It can challenge your business model and also help mitigate risk and increase competitive advantage, as in those cases we just saw. I think the challenge your business model and also create opportunities is one maybe for right now, which is particularly useful. given that many companies are starting to review how they're functioning and what they need to change to get over the COVID crisis. This would appear to be another way of resetting or re-evaluating how a business could operate with resilience at the core. So I'm not going to stay on that, but what I am going to do is think about some of the applications of the protocol. So these are the ones that are listed in the front of the protocol, and the 5 sort of most popular ones, this list is not exhaustive, are assessing risks and opportunities of the ones similar to the ones we've just gone through, to compare options where you're picking between one project or one product or an infrastructure investment and another, making a more holistic assessment, to assess the impact on particular stakeholder groups. So also very interesting if there's a particular group of stakeholders that might be impacted by your business decision to go expand in a particular area or to develop a particular area. And then estimating the total value or net impact, so quite an impact related approach, but one that tries to look at a company's value to society in the context of its activities. And finally, options for communicating the results of your assessment both internally and externally to help you justify some of the business decisions that you might make. Okay, so what's going on in the market at the moment? Well, it's an overview of assessments that's provided by the Capitals Coalition. So approximately over 200 companies worth of data here. And I think what's interesting is that the number of assessments on natural capital is quite high. So this seems to be the area that people have started to focus on. However, there is this 15% here of both natural, social and human capital assessments. Perhaps not surprisingly, we've got a large proportion of business doing these assessments. One would expect that because the protocol is aimed at a business audience, but it's still quite a high number of governments and finance institutions looking into this. And also, we've done a breakdown of the different types of assessments. And here again, it is quite interesting that the top area is estimating the total value and or net impact as the main favoured approach. And then secondly, the assess risk and opportunity. And I would say that that mirrors Little Blue Research's experience in this particular area. I think it often does come up where companies are seeking to try and look at holistically what they are doing for their communities and for stakeholders that interact with them, and trying to understand whether there are issues that they need to tackle. So that can form part of this total estimate of value. Okay, so this is a breakdown of really the next couple of sections that we're going to talk about. We assume that an objective for your assessment has been defined. So let's just keep that in mind. And also, once we've got that clear objective, and we'll be returning to the importance of that throughout the session, we're going to help start thinking about how you might go about identifying your impacts and dependencies, then how you might scope your assessment, and finally take a quick look at the practicalities of assessment. So what I'm going to do now is skip through onto identifying impacts and or dependencies. And we're going to start with impacts. So the negative or positive effect of business activity on natural capital. And I think it's really important to consider the type of business activity that you're undertaking. And I would say as well that if you start off looking at a high level, it can be quite I think you can get a high level picture quickly of what your activities as a company might contribute to, but really in order to measure it, to quantify it, for it to be something that's decision useful, depending on the nature of your objective, you need to get down to a more micro level, and we'll start to show you what adding some additional context would mean in this case. So in terms of our business applications, this is very clearly on the estimating impact side, and would be part of an estimation of total value. So both the positive and negative impacts of your business. So when considering measuring our impact, what we need to understand is how we move from what inputs and outputs our business makes and how they relate to our products that we produce, and how they then go on to link to a longer term impact on nature. So in this particular case, the drawing on the right hand side of the slide is about the manufacture of a plastic cup. We can see that impact drivers, the measurable quantities of a natural resource used as an input to production, in this case, include the fresh water needed for manufacturing, but also land use needed. And then we have a few other natural capital dependencies, which we'll go on to. But that final piece, the measurable non-product output of a business activity. So this is where the more standard negative impact of business would feature. So things like GHG emissions, air pollutions, water discharges, etc. If we then flip that on its head and think about natural capital dependencies, it's the business reliance on or use of natural capital within their activities, within their business activities. And a nice way of thinking about this is with our coffee producer example here on the right hand side, where our coffee producer is reliant not only on the crop that he's getting, but he's reliant on pollinators to pollinate that crop. And if those pollinators die off because of either a natural catastrophe or some sort of discharge or pollution or overuse of fertilizer on the coffee plant, then this business is going to have to truck in those pollinators to make up for the shortfall, to still allow them to get the coffee they need to their manufacturing plants. And it's an interesting look at how your activities as a business, how they lead back to nature. What is it that you need to account for? So this really goes towards the resilience argument and acknowledging and understanding where you might be being supported by nature for free and what it would mean if that service wasn't available to you in the future. Right, so we're going to look at a bit of a hypothetical example to help us think these impacts and dependencies through. So I'm just going to go through the slide. In this case, we are a hypothetical cement works, and we want you to imagine that you're having to assess the natural capital impacts of the company. And by natural capital impacts, in this case, we want you to focus on the potential negative impacts of the company. It's a leading cement and concrete producer and distributor, and some of the most used resources for the production of cement and concrete are water, sand and gravel. The company has most of its operations in China, which are located near urban centres. And what I will add as a clarification is that when we're thinking of this assessment for right now, we want you to focus on the company's own operations rather than where it's mining or where it might be buying goods, sand and gravel from for its manufacture of cement and concrete. And finally, the company is one of the most sophisticated air filtration and cleaning technologies on its plants. So this is the context within which we're working. And what we want you to do is consider just 3 ecosystem services: water, air quality and biodiversity. We want you to think of the negative impact that these might be having for our cement company, and we want you to rank them. Again, using Menti, we want you to use a slider, rank low, medium and high. So if I ask Katia to come back and support me with the Menti question, and you to go to menti.com and enter that code. Fantastic, thank you, Katia. And as we did this morning, it's kind of like horse racing. We can see that water is well and truly up there in the high category, with biodiversity following shortly behind and air quality slightly lower down. And as in this morning's session, actually air and biodiversity were very neck and neck before the finish line, is still pretty neck and neck, and biodiversity is just edging it. So what we're going to do is give it a little bit more time. There are still a few more of you who can vote on Menti, so I'm going to give you a couple more minutes. Water is still in the lead and is continuing to do so, but biodiversity is catching up in some way. So we can see, okay, that those are the 3 rankings. So what I'm going to do now is ask Katia to stop. Thank you very much. And I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to show you what we did. So water in this particular case was up there as high as it was with most of your suggestions, and we were using that context from the cement works that water is highly used in the cement and concrete process. We put air quality as low, so it was quite neck and neck throughout that little game, if you like, that we just played. We put a context specifically in there about the filtration technologies available on the plants. Now, depending on your experience of the filtration technology, you may have thought, well, actually, I don't believe the filtration technology is going to have that much of an impact. But in our context that we were thinking about, we thought, okay, if they've got state-of-the-art technology, we can be less worried about air quality being an issue in this particular case. And finally, biodiversity we put as medium, and so it's just about the same order as everyone had on that little exercise. And we were thinking in terms of biodiversity being limited to the plants. We didn't tell you how many there were, but limited to the company's plants in urban centres, so that potentially that might not be as high impact as some of as the water use in the local context. But obviously you could see if that footprint was extended to where the mining occurred to get the sand and gravel, that biodiversity impact could be a lot higher if that was part of the company context. So ultimately, it's to really illustrate the point that context is the real key in determining how impacted different ecosystem services are and how you would rank them. And it's also the context of that objective that will also determine those rankings. So the higher level, the more difficult it is to pin down exactly what the right ranking would be in a given circumstance. So I'm just going to show you quickly another way, and then ask Katia to come in and talk about this as well. So this is an example, a case study example, real life one, done by a Nature Squared, who I believe are also on the training call today. And it's example of a small medium-sized enterprise in the fishery industry, looking at their impacts and ranking them relatively to the impacts each of their different business activities has on these ecosystem services and considering the stakeholders involved. And they use this to prioritize where they could take their actions. So those actions are listed down the side as immediate actions, and then there are options for further research. What I'm going to do is ask Katia if she wants to come in on this and talk any more about this example, and also check if there have been questions that you'd like me to answer.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So this is an example we love to share ever since we've heard about it. And Dan, please do share any additional information in the chat. So Dan, who's on the call, is the one that worked on this. And so the reason we like to show this example is because we often see an interest from companies to understand how can they get to a monetary evaluation of their impacts and dependencies. But in fact, before you get to that stage, there's a lot of work before that needs to be done. And the first one being, as Stephanie just walked us through, actually identifying what are your key impacts and dependencies. And similar to the exercise you just did, actually through that little exercise, you did a very simple qualitative assessment already of some key impacts and dependencies. And that's already very informative in itself. And you don't necessarily always have to go up to measuring and doing a monetary value to understand what decisions need to be informed. And so this is why we like to show this example, because this can already be a really good first step. And visually, it's already very helpful to understand where the main impacts and dependencies are. So actually right now you can see an example of a qualitative assessment that was done for their impacts, but the same was also done for the dependencies. So just an interesting element to keep in mind. So Stephanie, there has been some questions coming in. So we had one first comment, which I think relates particularly to the little exercise we did before, from Nora, who's asking if impact on water would also impact biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be completely depending on your business activity. So it's a potential that a business activity can impact on both and actually exacerbate one and the other. It is going to be quite context dependent though. So obviously with our cement case study, we really didn't give enough information to make that interlinkage clear at all. But you could imagine that there are instances where one impact might snowball or interlink to another. I guess what I would suggest, or we'll come onto with scoping, is it's the prioritization of what can be measured in the time and budget that's available that I think is really important. So it's not to assume that those interlinkages don't exist, but to find a way of navigating to measure the most important things to help with your decision within the context in which you're doing your assessment. So probably leave it there on that one for now. Are there any other questions?
No, so rather a remark from Monica saying that this is normally addressed in an environmental and social impact assessment of a company, or at least this is what is expected of a good study. And I think we also had somewhat of a similar comment this morning actually around the linkages also with, life cycle assessments. I don't know if you just want to address that again.
No, I think it is an interesting point. And yes, I think those impacts can be addressed through that kind of assessment. Those kinds of assessment are more prevalent in some sectors than others. But I would also say the interesting thing about the protocol assessment is the inclusion of dependencies as part of that. So it's a bit more of an extension to look at the resilience at the same time. Now, you can argue that certain sorts of application might limit that to just impacts, but I don't see it as a competing approach. I see it as something that's quite complementary and would also certainly use some of the outputs of those types of work as an input into this process. Cool.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. That's it. Just Dan that provided more information. So I think what he's mentioning is that it was for this SME particularly helpful in better understanding their impacts. And so what they've learned is that there were more impacts through sourcing of vegetables than they knew, whereas their impact through fishing was lower than they expected. So that's quite interesting. That's because they had already a lot of sustainable fishing practices. So it basically helped them really to uncover a clear blind spot for them, which is very much as well what you highlighted.
Cool. All right. So I'm just going to put this as a final slide to draw the cement example to a close. Here are some outputs of true value measurements for the cement industry. I don't want to draw your attention to all of the different things that they've measured, mostly because the font's too small for you to do so. I think there are some interesting points that I'd like to bring up. One of them is the commonality across the industry in terms of what has been measured from an environmental perspective. What I think is good is that there are some sector guides for the Natural Capital Protocol that have attempted to look at material impacts and dependencies for different parts of the value chain, and where one would expect certain industries to have high, medium or low impacts and dependencies on environmental topics. I think the other interesting thing about this goes back to the integrated nature of some of the measurements, which is each of these statements has environment as part of a wider assessment. But the final point I would make is that each of these assessments were not done in a short period of time. These took a significant amount of time and resource to do, and were really a journey over a number of years. And that journey started with some of these more qualitative assessments at the beginning and a prioritization to enable some initial scoping to start. So I'm going to leave it there on impacts and dependencies, and we're going to start thinking about scoping and assessment, which I have mentioned a little bit. So the main area here to think about is these 5 topic points on the side. So an organisational focus. Those last 3 cement examples were a corporate focus. What's the value across the whole business of our impact, and not only nature, but social, economic, etc. That is a huge task, as I intimated on the last slide, but you can start by limiting what you're looking at to a product level, a project, or a specific site. And if this is the first assessment that you're running, doing it at that level helps gauge or helps you to understand what might be needed when doing a larger assessment, and also the sorts of assumptions you might need to make if you want to scale that approach up to a corporate level. The value chain boundary. Interestingly enough, I don't think each of those cement examples included the entire supply chain. Some of them have included bits of it, but again, that's a decision that you need to make, and it will depend very much on your objectives. So at the moment, we at Little Blue Research are doing some work for the events sector, and we've been asked to look at the natural capital impact across the whole of the value chains for the sector, so upstream, direct operations, and downstream during the course of an event. So you can imagine that's a pretty big task and a pretty large thing to account for. So one of the first things to look at, or for us to think about, is whether or not direct operations, is there enough data to make an assessment at that level? If we did that, could we then start to look at upstream and downstream as in a phased way during our approach? So the next point is specifies the value perspective. So do you want to understand these values from a business perspective internally for your own business costs and to look at decisions just purely from your point of view, or do you want to look at societal costs and benefits alongside? It will be entirely dependent on the type of decision that you're trying to make. In the case of those value statements that we saw, there are some elements of both business and social costs that have been costs and benefits that have been added to those different valuations. You then need to decide whether or not you're focusing on impact and or dependencies. As was pointed out both on earlier calls today and on today's call, use of certain impact assessment methodologies do focus on impacts in particular, can also help to do value statements just focusing on impacts. But there is a case to say, okay, having a look at impacts and dependencies at the same time is really important when you're thinking about your decision. But again, it's going to depend on the context in which you're operating. And finally, the types of value you'll consider: qualitative, quantitative, and monetary. And I would say in order to get to monetary valuation, you are likely to have needed to do a qualitative look at your data to start with, then attempt to quantify it in some manner before you can proceed to monetary valuation. Monetary valuation is the most challenging out of all of those, but they all have challenges in relation to data and the amount of the different sorts of techniques that can be used with each. So I'm going to skip through now to identifying our target audience. Again, another really important point that will be dependent on the objective of your assessment. So there's a great Hugo Boss example that will be available in the final version of module 2, and it looks at the group trying to move to a more sustainable product line. So the focus of their assessment, the target audience of their assessment, was absolutely senior executives and directors. Now, it happens the outputs of some of that assessment work are now in the public domain, but initially the consumers of that assessment were going to be senior executives to try and get their buy-in for a greener product. So some really interesting work that they've managed to do. But as you can see, there are any number of different stakeholders that might be important as your target audience, but that will be dependent on what your assessment is trying to do and which decision you're trying to help someone make. And finally, identifying key stakeholders and how you engage with them. So a stakeholder is anyone who has an interest or a stake in the outcome of your decision that you're trying to make. So that's both internal and external stakeholders. There are some great examples of NGOs and private companies working through some of the impact and dependency exercises together. Nadine McCormack, who was on this morning and on some of our test training, shared anecdotes where her and her group worked with private companies to look at impacts and dependencies together. And by doing that, it helped both the business group and the NGO appreciate how and why certain impacts had been identified as part of the process. So it's also an interesting way of thinking about how to engage with relevant people. But again, it's going to come down to your objective and the time and resources you have to do an assessment. So I'm going to now come back to Katia, who's going to introduce Paula and the case study and business presentation for today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Great. Just going to get onto. So this is actually a perfect timing to hand over to Paula. So Stephanie, you've just walked us through some really helpful, rather theoretical aspects, while also exercising practically some of the key concepts you've introduced to us. And so Paula is actually going to now walk us through about her experience in using the Natural Capital Protocol. And what's interesting with the Navigator company is that they've actually gone through the process of using the protocol, and more specifically the forest sector specific guidance. And so they've done that on top of an existing approach that they already had. And so what she's going to do is share some of the key learnings she had from this process, and as well as some practical tips for you guys that may be starting into this journey. So Paula, a huge thanks again. And with no further ado, I'll hand over to you now. Thanks, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you. Just start sharing my screen. Is it working already?
So not quite yet.
Okay, perhaps I didn't do it right. Is it okay?
No, we're not seeing them yet.
Sorry.
Would you like for me to share?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, okay, no worries.
I had a message of host disabled. Oh.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, as you said, Katja, we are an integrated business company. So we are indeed in the pulp and paper sector. We have also produce tissue paper and energy, but we actually manage forests. So because of this integrated business, we are actually working with nature. So that's what led us to doing these assessments. Next slide, please. So because we work with nature, we work with our forest plantations. We have planted forests for our raw materials, of course, for all our productions. But interspersed with our production forests, we also have multiple use forest spaces and other patches of what used to be a more autochthonous or even natural forest in Portugal. In Portugal, you don't have anymore much big areas of natural forest. You have these patches that you have to recognize. So we also have some of these zones interspersed with our production areas, and that's where we focused our interest because, and the next slide, please. Because we believe that there's a role of well-managed plantations in what concerns biodiversity, because first of all, of course, well-managed plantations can reduce pressure of extracting raw materials from areas in which these natural forests still exist. And while doing this, it's indirectly contributing to their conservation. But also when you are in geographical contexts where you don't have much of these natural forests, these ones provide really opportunities for supply the needs of forest-based industries, and of course feed what today is getting more and more important, that is this circular bioeconomy. So we believe that since you adequately locate your forest production areas and also manage them sustainably, they're able to maintain and even improve the biodiversity levels and the people's livelihoods. So next slide, please. So in 2008, that's when the Forest Solutions Group in WBCSD, working with the Natural Capital Coalition, published the Forest Products Sector Guide. This sector guide contains additional information, sector specific. So it's very useful for companies acting in the forest sector. And the Forest Solutions Group gave its members the opportunity of testing the sector guide in different ways. So either you could do it in a specific project to assess from scratch and get into any sort of valuation, or amongst other possibilities, you could do your assessment of the methodologies that you had in place already. And that's what we chose to do. because as I said, we were working, yes, with nature for a long time. We had developed our own approaches, and we thought this was important because biodiversity actually is part of the natural capital that we deal with, that we depend on, but that we can also potentially impact on. So because we have 11% of areas in our estate, the estate we manage, as classified as zones with interest for conservation, we have to have an ongoing systematic approach in our daily business to understand what they are, know more, and conserve. Yes, next please. So in our conservation strategy, we rely on the information that we collect from our research and development. So we have we have mapped all our activities and operations against impacts, drivers on soil, water, biodiversity, air, etc. We have these big environmental and social impact assessment matrices. And wherever we start an operation for specific operations that have potentially more impact, we do a pre-assessment of the impacts, starting on these matrices and then confirming them locally on a site assessment. And then we integrate in the forest management model to apply on site, we integrate measures that are specifically defined for conservation of these patches of other vegetation that potentially are interesting habitats to be preserved. So this is a diagram that shows our cyclical approach to biodiversity conservation. And of course, because in Portugal you have an important area of Natura 2000 and also the national network of protected areas, you have to be very aware of these specifically sensitive areas, and then you have to be aware of potentially classified habitats are in place, or even species that are identified as too important for conservation. So because we had developed all this approach for over 10 years, we started with an NGO, and then we worked with Portuguese conservation specialists. We felt this was time in 2008 to assess ourselves, assess our own methodologies, and that was the business case for us to start and assess the natural capital according to the protocol. Next, please. So the use of the protocol was exactly to evaluate how reliable our existing assessment procedures were. But we also wanted to align them with an internationally agreed framework. So if we made this thorough analysis, we could perhaps find out gaps, and we wanted to align and streamline also what we were doing. But we also wanted to by assessing our own approaches to strengthen the business case for well-managed plantaforests. So on one hand, it was challenging our own model, but also taking advantage of being able to prove what we believed in. And of course, to explore some other opportunities, either in communications or decision-making, which can be done at the project level. So these were the three main aspects that led us to use the protocol for the assessment. So how did we do it? So we started going through the protocol framework, you know, step by step, and reading it against what we had in place already, and doing like a gap analysis, but also using data that we had collected over this approach that had more than 10 years. So at the end, we had assessed how close we were from all these steps. And we worked with an external consultant also, because we wanted to have them assisting us on a maturity analysis. It's different when you have a third party that is independent looking at what you are doing. And they also helped us facilitate a meeting with a panel so that we could discuss with external stakeholders the approach that we had developed, and the importance of aligning it with the protocol. Okay. So what we did was, as you see here, we went through all the steps. We defined, as if we had nothing done, we cross-checked all steps, what was the audience for us, what was the organizational focus, the value chain, boundary, etc., etc. And then we decided that it would be a corporate approach, because we were not looking at biodiversity in one place. We were looking at an approach. We were looking at the methodology. So it was for every place in which we have forests. And we have forests from north to south, from inland to coast. So we have to have an approach that works well everywhere, from smaller to bigger forest management units in different geographic parts of the country. So we went step by step. And one thing that we understood is that it's very important when you start using the protocol that you clarify very well what is the purpose of the assessment you're doing, and detail all this rationale behind the scope. So the first parts of the protocol are very good for you to, settle down your ideas and clarify why you're doing this and what are the aspects that you are going to take into consideration. And then, because this helps you plan the resources that you will need for the assessment, and also get some buy-in from the company. So a tip I would give would be to be very methodic when you start doing an assessment. And it happened to us, even that we had our methodology in place. All of a sudden we questioned ourselves. We went back to previous steps and evolved again. So this was very good, because we had an opportunity to rethink a little bit what we had done, and to find potential gaps to be improved. Okay, next. This is a short image, an excerpt from our environmental and social impact assessment. So we have this table. It's a big Excel spreadsheet in which we have all our activities, operations, all sorts of different impact drivers. And then we have some significance filters, like in environmental assessment, but we have environmental and social impact considered in these matrices. And we also cross-check this with the aspects that are meant in the protocol. So we found it aligned very well. So one thing that I would share, it came up, was that when you start, you may be led to think, okay, I've never done evaluation, I've never done this systematic approach, and you may underestimate what you have. So make use of all available information that you have, and perhaps when you've done something already, it's very useful, and you may value what you have in place. But also, besides drawing in this points of parity between the methodologies in place and the protocol, You may also find gaps that will help you increase knowledge in your company and also improve the procedures. And that's what happened. Okay. So the outcomes and learnings that we took is that we actually found a very good alignment between our procedures and the protocols frameworks. We only addressed impacts, and that was something curious. We always thought about impacts. We never thought about dependencies, although we are aware of the dependencies, but we had never looked at dependencies in a systematic way. So going through the impacts, we found this very good alignment, except for the valuation, because we hadn't start a valuation in terms of giving monetary value to the natural capital. And we also found out that since this is a consistent, a very systematic approach, and that go through this very organized way of looking at the natural capital, the impacts, and how you can tackle to mitigate them. Implementing this in a consistent way over the years gives room to have actual data of how impacts are mitigated, and positive impacts on natural capital show as increased areas of natural habitats that you'll identify, and also some numbers of improving the conservation stages of these natural habitats, which may be classified habitats under Natura 2000, but also that species, the species that they support. So we have already a lot of data coming from this approach over more than 10 years of species, of different groups, and both fauna and flora. So valuation is exactly not the objective. That's something that became clearer. It's one of the objectives, but even if you're not doing a valuation or a monetary valuation, which for biodiversity is really difficult to address because you don't have much data available, doing the protocol, even if it's the first steps up to measuring, is already a big gain to the company and a big gain to the environment and to natural capital, because you can pretty much control and better implement your activities, your economic activities. So this good alignment, finding that there was a good alignment, also gave a very good feedback, a very good, a positive message inside the company to our corporate leaders, because we have been investing a lot in this conservation approach. So it's very good when you have this positive feedback from implementing the protocol after this time. So this was also a very nice outcome that we got. Okay. So as reflections, I would say that you always have to have a starting point. You have to know what are the values that you have in place, what is the natural values that you have in place, so that you can be able to value them, to give them importance, and to conserve them. So natural capital assessments are essential. These are the basis of any action. It's the starting point. So the natural capital protocol may be also a good opportunity for someone who hasn't started any natural capital assessments as a framework, because it helps frame the work, allocate resources, manage business impact. So it's using this framework is very good for who hasn't yet started. Another reflection was on dependencies. As I said, although we were aware of dependencies, of course, we know that we depend on land, we depend on land having appropriate moisture, we depend on the ecosystem's balance, but we never looked at dependencies in a systematic way. So this was a learning that they are known, not treated the same systematic way yet, But if you think a little bit, and more today, you have this very clear interaction between climate and nature. And perhaps if you look at the resilience of businesses, we will start looking at dependencies in a more systematic way too in the future, like we do with impacts. So it's a reflection also. So, and besides all this, of course, getting data is good for you to report, to communicate, even for these well-known reporting frameworks. Well, as recommendations, so if you haven't started doing anything, start by making this good characterization of the departing point. So plan everything ahead so that you don't have to, you know, that you are effective and you don't have to make like a puzzle every time you want to progress. But if you have started the assessment, it's very good to align guidelines, and this helps in benchmarks with other companies, and also to improve what you have in place. So as success factors, just to finalize my presentation, as success factors, I would say that it's good to have allies inside the company, especially from top management that have to gain their buy-in, but also from operational areas, which are the ones where potentially putting impacts on the ground. So it's very good that you work with these allies inside the company, but also that you engage with specialists. So more and more science-based approaches are called in what we do. So engaging with specialists is essential. And I would say, and that's what I have to tell you about our experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paula. This was really helpful. And I know you've mentioned it already this morning, and I'll say it again for this afternoon session. I really like your last tip of having allies. And it's something that's been coming out quite a lot in our interactions we've had with the businesses through the We Value Nature campaign. And it is really key. And finally, also really good to hear as well the reflections around dependencies. And I think this is something that Stephanie also highlighted, which is, you know, becoming increasingly relevant with the tight interconnections that we're seeing today with the crisis. So thank you again so much. This was really helpful. One question we have from Nora, and we have just a few minutes to answer, so that's perfect, around what are the indicators that were used to monitor impact on biodiversity, and how did you measure biodiversity, for example, species richness, function, etc.?
Right. Okay, that's the best question. Okay, so we have an annual monitoring program every year. So we go into our the area that we manage into specific forest management units that we know that are going to be intervened. So that we start by crossing the information, our maps, with the maps of Natura 2000 and the National Network of Protected Areas. So we do first office work, crossing this map information, but also assessing the potential habitats and species that may be in place. And when we talk about species, we do the main group species. We do mammals, we do birds, we do, I'm looking for the words in English, we do reptiles, etc. So we take information of potential species, but then we go on the ground, and we do some transacts. So we do our assessments. We have this annual program, but we also have some specific assessments on the ground for management units that are going to be intervened. So we take the information, we cross with the data that we have. We have developed some internal manuals from different manuals and from the information from the different biodiversity conventions, and we have internal manuals that are used on the ground for these local assessments. every year we hire the help of some specialists. For instance, there may be a year focusing on winter prey species. There may be a year in which you invest more in a specific mammals, but we cross this different species every year. So we have a big database of information on species. They're important for conservation. So you know the different endangered, critically endangered, least concern, etc., etc. We look at the presence or the indication of presence of these species. And as for habitats, we cross the information of the apparent vegetation types, and we interpret it as being these Natura 2000 habitats. And then we look also at the conservation status. So we have a classification of habitats being degraded, evolutionary, or developed, or climatic. So we classify also the habitats, and we have conservation measures depending on the status in which they are. So when we go and do our operational planning of the measures for the productive forest, we also include conservation measures for these patches of other vegetation that may be around, okay? Even there are some measures even for areas which are not under our direct responsibility, but are nearby. So if you have a nest of, for instance, an important prey species that is endangered, and if the buffer comes inside our forest management unit, we also integrate the measures for conservation. So we have this, we have been developing, of course, this, it was not 1 year or two. This has taken several years, and it has been improving during the years. But we have a very solid approach that we have been putting in place. So I hope I have answered. Oh, remote sensing. Yeah. Yes, remote sensing. We had a project this last 2 years. I think it was our first project directly on biodiversity. It's from a colleague of mine that was doing his master's on looking at carbon sequestration in riparian forests. So, but yeah, it could be something to use more, because nowadays we have a lot of data from local evaluations, and this could give us a broader view of what we have. Yeah, definitely.
Super. Thank you so much, Paula. This has been really helpful. And before we wrap up, I am going to hand over again to Stephanie, who's going to share some final insights into practical considerations when planning an assessment. So thanks again, Paula, and over to you, Steph.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So hopefully at the end of these two sections, we've learned a bit about identifying impacts and dependencies and the starting of scoping and assessment. So the last piece we're going to look at is some of these practical considerations associated with planning and assessment. And these are the main 5 points that I've alluded to them during the presentation, but we're just going to go through them quickly now. So the timescale. When does your decision have to be made by? How long do you have to do your assessment? We've worked with clients whereby an assessment has had between 3 and 6 months worth of time, in which case what we're assessing and the scope of what we're assessing has had to be quite narrow to fit within the time frame available. We've had other clients where the process has started off with a very narrow assessment for 3 months, and then actually iterated and developed into a much larger, longer term process. Funding and resources, again, what budget is available and who do you have within your team that can help you run your assessment? It's particularly important on some of the measurements that we've been discussing today. So the biodiversity measurements and some of the science-based measurements require some scientific and specialist knowledge. Likewise, the monetization of some of these quantifications require a specialized knowledge of environmental economics. And it's just a call out to say that depends on your objective, but also the resources, time, money that you have, and the level of buy-in, I think, in the organization to your project. So again, that whole piece around having allies and buy-in at a more senior level. Likewise, data availability and accessibility. Paola talked about looking at the data that you have already and where that can be used for an assessment. I think also need to acknowledge that sometimes data isn't available because you're asking a different question. So the systems that have been set up to collect data within your company have all been put there for a particular purpose, and that purpose is unlikely to be completely aligned with your need to do a natural capital assessment. It doesn't mean it isn't helpful, but there should be an acknowledgement that you may have to look for different ways of obtaining data and different sources of data to help you through your assessment. And finally, again, we've talked about it throughout the presentation, but that stakeholder relationships, how you engage with stakeholders, what's the capacity, what's the time scale of your assessment, how can you get stakeholders involved? Will you have time to bring them in and do workshops? Will you have time only to look at research on stakeholder opinion within the area of interest that you're looking at? So it's very dependent on this time and budget and capacity considerations. And other considerations of note are what baseline you're going to use. So what are you going to compare yourself to? That in itself can be a challenge. Most people, when they, particularly when they want a valuation done, want that valuation to have been compared with some past situation. And unfortunately, that doesn't tend to happen, mostly because the past situation doesn't have the right data, didn't have the right systems in place. So once you've put your valuation approach together, it actually tends to be the starting point, year one, the baseline for a total value assessment, in my experience. It's not to say that that's the case everywhere, but I think it's worth thinking about what data you want to compare yourself to and why it would make sense in your decision making context and for the objective of your assessment. Other questions to consider: do you want to use scenarios? So do you want to start off with a valuation today and then think about situations in the future? And then some other points to consider: the geography, how much timing, is it for 1 year, is it an assessment of value over 10 years, and so on. So final practical tips for success in this section: defining the clear purpose and objective. We've said it a number of times throughout the course. Engagement of stakeholders. Make sure your project is tailor-made and answers the questions you need it to answer for your decisions. And then try to get simple and accessible results. So this comes down to your target audience and what you need them to understand to help you make your decisions. So we have covered all three of these elements in today's training, and I'm just going to very quickly wrap up as we draw to a close. So some of the takeaways that we believe you should have got are seeing that business does depend on and impact on nature. finding some initial ways of identifying impacts and dependencies, and using the protocol as a framework to help you do that systematically, that your company can do those first steps, and there are ways of going through that are quite simple, but that some consideration is needed for the scope of those assessments. So what we want to do is run one last Menti poll. So what we want to do is think about what the takeaway key learning point you have had from this course is. So I'm just going to ask Katia to go to the Menti so that we can capture that final point.
So please ignore the first two that you can see here. It's run a shift to the right screen.
No problem. So what are the key learnings? I can see some very shy people. It's a long process, not a quick assessment. Natural resources are common goods which may infinitely available to everyone at no cost. Interesting too. So, you know, I think the main point I've been trying to get across, and I think we've shown, is that some of these assessments are pretty complex, and that an initial thinking, an initial iterative approach is necessary, but that can take a bit of a while. Learning by doing, also true, as we've suggested, trying to start with some simple qualitative approach is helpful to prioritize issues, and also helping highlight risk and opportunities, different values, effective for communication. So thank you for putting that in there. Use of assessment is about estimated values, not much integrating into policy, not yet much integrating into policy. I think that's a good point as well. So yes, there are estimates, but the question is whether having those estimates makes you do a more well-rounded decision in the context that you're in. So I believe the saying is, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good, or something similar like that. So how best to use some information rather than none. Okay, so thank you very much for that, Katia. I appreciate it. I'm going to jump back to our screen and just do the last couple of slides. So eager to get started. As Katia has said, and in fact I'm going to hand over to her now, resources are available on the We Value Nature training resources page, as well as natural capital protocol training. So if Katia, you want to take over.
Sure, thanks so much. Yeah, so as we've mentioned today, you've had a quick overview of Module 2 training, but you'll soon be able to access the full module on our resource page. And then finally, I think Ryan actually just sent the link. Thanks for that, Ryan. And then finally, there's many other things that we do with We Value Nature. That includes monthly virtual office hour calls where we discuss different topics around nature. We do online training, train-to-trainer sessions, as well as webinars. So if any of these are of interest to you, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly. Finally, before I end, I would love to ask you to please take a few minutes to respond to our feedback survey. That will be really helpful to understand how we can continue helping you the best way possible. And that also includes elements like upcoming new training modules around the food and beverage sector, which we're also going to be starting to develop soon. So lots of upcoming things for you guys. Before I close this session, I'd like to say a huge thanks to obviously Stephanie for guiding us through this training, and for the rest of the team, Sabina and Ryan, for helping develop this training module. And a huge thanks obviously as well to Paula for guiding us through your experience with the Natural Capital Protocol. And finally, of course, thanks to all of you guys for sticking until the end of this session. And I hope you've all come back with a little key lesson and the next step you can take in your natural capital journey. So big thank you again to everyone, and I wish you a lovely end of your day or beginning of day. Thank you.